Hi, welcome to Think Tech Asia, coming to you from downtown Honolulu. I'm your host, Hong Jiang. I'm associate professor of geography at University of Hawaii at Manoa. And my guest today is Dr. Patricia Masters, and our topic is Tibetan Buddhism and its practice in Hawaii. So Dr. Patricia Masters is Associate Director at the Office of Student Equity, Excellence, and Diversity. She's also a faculty of political science at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She has been a practitioner of Buddhism. So in today's program, we are going to focus on Tibetan Buddhism. Dr. Pat Masters talk about the origin beliefs of Tibetan Buddhism, and also share with our audience members about Tibetan Buddhism, how it's practiced, practitioners, and the community in Hawaii. And Pat, thank you so much for being here.
And thank you, Han, for having me.
Maybe first we can have you talk a little bit about your experience with Buddhism. How did you start it?
Okay, I first sort of came to Buddhism, as many of my generation did, through literature that really has little to do with Buddhism, and that was Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse.
I love that book.
I love it too.
Yeah.
I think it's lovely, and it's vaguely related to the life of Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha. So I read that in high school, and I just found the philosophy so beautiful and the story so beautiful. I started UCLA, and I was taking Japanese language. I had taken it in high school, and my first Japanese language teacher was a Vietnamese monk. And he was so serene and so lovely. And I stayed after class a lot to talk with him. And he invited me to his monastery in downtown LA. So I went and I started meditating there, and I was just so fascinated. I wanted to know more. So I started taking classes in Buddhism at UCLA, and I ended up doing my master's in Buddhist studies and started my doctorate, and then left the doctoral program and came over here and actually ended up doing my PhD in political philosophy. But there was a lot in it that was so resonant with Buddhism. But I had been practicing since I was about 18, and at some point, and it was around mid-90s, I heard about a program in India that was run by Antioch University, and it's one of the best study abroad programs in the world. It's been going for about 45 years. And there was a little ad in the Asian Studies Journal about going and teaching in India for this Buddhist Studies program. And I had been teaching in political science and all of that, and I just wanted the experience. So I went to India and I taught for Antioch for 4 years, and I lived in the Buddhist monastery, and while I was there I became very close with 2 nuns. They were actually from a different tradition than I had really been practicing, but I started studying with them, and I decided to ordain. So I ordained in their tradition, which is the Burmese tradition. It's part of the Theravadan stream of Buddhism. But for me, Buddhism is Buddhism. I don't see it as sectarian. I see it as there's a philosophical system, and then there are different practices within that philosophical system. And
yeah,
so
we're going to definitely get into some of those in the later discussion. Yeah.
Absolutely.
What's fascinating is that you were once ordained like a practitioner. Do you call it?
As a nun.
As a nun, okay.
Yeah.
How was life as ordained nun from life now in the ordinary society?
I really loved the experience. It deepened my relationship to Buddhism, but it also gave me some real insights into institutional Buddhism, which were both positive and not so positive, because I was already so in love with the philosophy and practicing, meditating every day, and all of that. But it was very interesting to see the dynamics within the Sangha of the ordained. So, for example, a nun has to bow to a novice monk, even if he's been a monk for a day and you've been a nun for 50 years.
Oh,
So
wow,
that was, and
interesting.
this is in the Theravadan tradition. It's not so much in the Mahayana tradition. Maybe I should explain. There are three sort of major streams in Buddhism,
Well,
right?
that's good. Let's get there because I
Okay.
wanted to have you
Yeah.
talk about the
Okay,
different
so,
schools.
so the first stream, the teachings of the elders, is actually called Nikaya Buddhism. It's now sort of referred to as Theravada. Theravada meaning the way of the elders. And how that came to be was that Theravada was one of 18 schools that developed just after the Buddha died. There were all different sort of understandings and interpretations of the Buddha's teachings. So they developed these different schools to address their interpretations of the Buddha's teaching.
That's right.
And the one that survived was Theravada. But that whole group, is now being referred to by scholars as Nikaya Buddhism, Nikaya. So those are the earliest 18 schools of Buddhism. And the places where that form of Buddhism is practiced is primarily Southeast Asia. So it's Thailand, Burma, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, parts of India, parts of the West, certain places in Nepal, but primarily, it's called Southern Buddhism quite often, and it's referring to Southeast Asia. And then around the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE, there developed some new ideas about the Buddha's teachings, and that sort of created the second stream, which is called Mahayana, which is translated as the greater vehicle. And some of the changes that took place were the idea of emptiness, which is a very deep concept in Buddhism, that all things are composites and that everything is empty of a permanent nature. So what happened with the Mahayana school is that they believed that, first of all, we seek enlightenment not just for ourselves, but for every living being on the planet. And that's actually the same in Theravada or Nikaya Buddhism, but it's emphasized in Mahayana. So there's something called the Bodhisattva, and that's one who becomes enlightened, but decides not to take full enlightenment to stay on the planet to help other people. There are living bodhisattvas right now. I would say the Dalai Lama is a bodhisattva. I'd say Thich Nhat Hanh's a bodhisattva. So there are living bodhisattvas. So that was one of the distinguishing features. The other is the idea of emptiness. Another is that you can be enlightened in this very life.
I see.
And that was sort of a new idea because in the Theravadan school or the Nikaya schools, the idea is that it's a very slow process and that it takes many lifetimes to reach full enlightenment. Well, in Mahayana, they said you can do it right now, right here and now, that we have the capability.
If the first school, Nikaya school, is practiced mostly in Southeast Asia, what about the Mahayana school?
Okay, so Mahayana is practiced in Japan, China, Korea, and then some people consider Tibetan Buddhism part of Mahayana, the larger Mahayana school, but there is a third stream called Vajrayana, and scholars will locate Tibetan Buddhism under the Vajrayana stream. So Vajrayana is the overarching, and it's more of the esoteric teachings. And it developed out of Tantrism in India. And the Tantric ideas were more, I would say, more secret teachings, if you will. Secret only in the sense that you need to have a teacher. You have to have transmission from a teacher to a student. You can't just say, okay, I'm going to do Tantrism now. You know, there has to be a transmission. And so Vajrayana is that school. And under Vajrayana, you have the Tantric schools, but you have Tibetan Buddhism. But Tibetan Buddhism isn't what everybody thinks it is, because there are several countries in which Vajrayana is practiced, but you wouldn't call them actually Tibetan Buddhism. For example, Mongolia, Sikkim, parts of China, Nepal. So there are, that's where the Vajrayana schools are. What happened with Tibetan Buddhism was it developed around the 8th century.
Okay.
There were two teachers who were requested by the king of Tibet to come and to share this new tantric understanding of Buddhism with the people of Tibet. The people of Tibet had traditionally been Bon, B-O-N, followers. It's an animistic indigenous belief system. And so Padmasambhava was an Indian practitioner and scholar, and he came and so impressed the king and the people, and there are a lot of legends surrounding his supernatural abilities and all of that. But he brought the teachings of Tantrism to Tibet. And then what happened over time was that the indigenous belief system of Bon got integrated in with the tantric ideas, and it created this new amalgamation called Tibetan Buddhism.
So you wouldn't call Tibetan Buddhism Tantrism, but
You still would.
You still
could.
could.
You
Okay.
could, because it's foundationally tantric.
Okay.
Okay. But there are distinguishing features in the Tibetan Buddhist understandings that come from Bon and from other Mahayana ideas. So it's a very interesting, complex form of Buddhism. The Tibetans say that they are the quickest way to enlightenment.
So it's one lifetime, just like the
One
Mahayana?
lifetime.
Okay.
Yeah, well, that's why sometimes they subsume Tibetan Buddhism under the Mahayana umbrella.
Okay.
But it's very distinct, and some of the distinctions are quite interesting.
Tell us about it, because I've been meaning to ask you
Yeah,
about what's unique about Tibetan Buddhism.
Yeah, I'd say that one of the things is that, first of all, you have to have a teacher, and there has
Okay.
to be a transmission.
Okay.
Okay,
Would
that-
Dalai Lama be seen as the teacher?
Well, for one of the schools, he's the overarching kind of spiritual leader of the Tibetan
okay.
people. But and he's part of the Gelugpa school. There are four main schools of Tibetan Buddhism. There's the Nyingma, the Kagyupa, the Gelugpa, and the Sakyapa. And he's part of the Gelugpa school. But he had teachers within the Nyingma, within the Kagyu. So it's not a matter of saying I'm only this way. These four schools developed because of particular teachers and what they brought to an understanding of Tibetan Buddhism. So again, there's always this kind of, interpretive sort of thing going on where people say, this is the way I see it, and then people follow that particular teacher saying, okay, I agree that that's the better practice, or that's my practice, or that's what suits me most. Okay, so one of the factors is that you have to have transmission, you have to have a teacher.
Yeah.
Another of the features of Tibetan Buddhism is that there's a focus on developing consciousness for the moment of death. And this is distinctive. Not a lot of the other schools emphasize this whole focusing on the dying process. In some of the Tibetan schools, some of the teachers say that's your whole purpose of being here, is to live your life so that you develop your consciousness. And that consciousness is for that moment of death, so that you have a better rebirth, or you have full awakening.
In terms of this consciousness of death, are all schools of Tibetan Buddhism focusing on this? This is equally important for all
It's
schools?
pretty much
Okay.
a major sort of focus within Tibetan Buddhism.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to explore a little bit more of the specific understanding of death after the break. But in addition to awareness of death, any other particular traits that would define Tibetan Buddhism?
Particular practices. So there's a practice, the entry practice into becoming a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner is called the Nundro practices, and those are given to you by your teacher. So for example, 100,000 prostrations, guru yoga, doing mantra or chanting, focusing on visualization of the qualities of the Buddha or of your teacher. There are several that those kinds of practices that distinguish a person who's practicing Tibetan Buddhism from other forms of Mahayana
I see.
Buddhism.
Okay, let's take a quick break, and then we're going to continue explore this. This is Think Tech Asia. I'm your host, Hong Jiang, and we've been talking about Tibetan Buddhism. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Martin Despang, and I'm the host together with the one and only Ali Amashta, and our show is called Urban Transcendence. And Urban Transcendence is about identifying where we have a unique situation of a vibrant city in one of the most beautiful natural environments. So how these two can coincide, sometimes conflict, how they could find reciprocity in the 21st century is what we're excited about. And we're planning on bringing in a diverse body of guests, both from the arts and the science and the established and the wise and the emerging generation. So hope you will join us. We'll always be on Thursdays from 1 to 2 p.m. Thank you.
Hi, we're back. We're live, and this is Think Tech Asia. We've been talking with Dr. Patricia Masters about Tibetan Buddhism and its practice in Hawaii. So right before the break, we were talking about what's unique about Tibetan Buddhism. Anything you want to add about that?
Yeah, I think that some of the distinguishing features, again, is that there is a relationship to a teacher. You find what's called your root guru, or the person who you resonate most with. And then you stay with that teacher in order to begin these practices. And the teacher will be introducing you to the practices as he or she sees your development. And so the introductory practices of Nundro, like I said, the prostrations, mandala practice, mandala being sort of a cosmographic representation
I
of
know
the
you see a lot of that.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful iconographic representations.
Yeah.
Guru or deity yoga, where you might focus on, for example, Tara, who is she is kind of a manifestation of compassion. And Tara sort of developed out of the teardrop of coming from Chenrezig's eye. Chenrezig is the Tibetan sort of manifestation of compassion. Just as in India, it's Avalokiteshvara, in China, it's Kuan Yin, in Japan, it's Kannon. There is an iconographic representation of this concept of compassion. Of course, compassion is one of the foundational ideas in Buddhism, as we both know. And so people will focus their attention on Tara and will do visualizations, do chanting, mantra practice, all of these different practices with this one particular iconographic representation. It's not like praying to a god. There is no god in Buddhism at all. People talk about deities. This is a much later sort of transliteration or translation of the idea of Buddha nature and of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, who was born 2,600 years ago. Okay, so then in Tibetan Buddhism, some of the things again are the bodhisattva ideal, that you want to generate what's called bodhicitta, which is a desire to awaken, but not just for yourself, but for all living beings. And so compassion, again, is the motivating force. And then this whole attention to developing your consciousness, and particularly for the moment of death.
Before we get to consciousness of death, I want to ask you an overarching question about Buddhism in general. You know, looking at all different schools. Well, I guess these are the three major schools. There are probably others beyond this, but what are the overarching ideas of Buddhism overall? You know, as a Buddhist scholar, this would be the best fitting question for you.
Right. Well, the foundational teachings are that we're struggling in the world, that we have a sense of dissatisfaction or not complete happiness because of ignorance, because of choices that we make, because of desire. And that there's a cause of that, and that's thirst for more things, more relationships, more everything, and that there's a way to to let that all go, which is the awakening process, and that there's a path, and the path is loosely sort of configured as 8 sort of practices or 8 developments, but lots of schools include other things. There's ethical practices that Buddhists believe in. The overarching idea is that you need to have a balance between the wisdom that you get from understanding the way things really are and compassion. So those are that everything has to be in balance. That if you only have wisdom but you have no compassion, there's no way that you're really going to have any kind of awakening.
Okay.
And if you only have compassion and you have no wisdom, Chogyam Trungpa, one of the Tibetan teachers who was here in the 60s and 70s and 80s, said he called it idiot compassion. And you've met people who have idiot compassion, I'm sure, people who want to do good, but they're not informed with any kind of wisdom, so that they sometimes end up making a mess of things, that they end up making idiot compassion.
I see. That's
sort of,
interesting concept.
But that those ideas of wisdom and compassion as the sort of the balance in Buddhism, and tolerance, and it's really a practice to develop your own mind. It's really to come to a place of understanding reality as it really is, and not the illusions that we all live with about what really is going on, both in our minds and in the world. So these practices, the foundational practices of ethical behaviors, and this development of wisdom and compassion and tolerance are sort of foundational for all schools of Buddhism.
Okay.
Everybody sort of, if they're considered Buddhist, these are the foundational teachings.
Is it fair to say that these are the foundations and the methods are probably different?
That's it.
From the different schools.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's the practices, it's the interpretations off of those first teachings of the Buddha.
Yeah. And
Exactly.
also the idea of awakening or enlightenment. Are there different understandings from the different schools about what is to be enlightened?
Oh, well, no, actually, I think that's pretty much shared. I think it's what becomes awakened is your consciousness about the reality of things, and that it's letting go of the illusions. It's I think awakening is pretty much a shared understanding among schools.
So awakening is like you really understand reality of existence, reality of being.
And the nature of your own mind.
Okay.
Yeah. So we work with so many, sort of mistaken notions that we inherit, that we learn as we grow up, and that we just develop on our own sometimes, and so what the Buddhists say is to let go of that and to do the practices that will bring a clear understanding of the reality of things.
Great. Let's talk about consciousness of death.
Okay, so there's a practice in Tibetan Buddhism. It's called Phowa, P-H-O-W-A. And it's an amazing practice. I did the trainings for it about 3 times, twice in India and once in Maui, where one of the major teachers of it came to teach the people of Maui. And what it is there are practices that you do to understand the whole dying process, so that you really see what's happening as there's a dissolution, as you physically start to change and mentally start to change in the dying process. It's not morbid, it's fascinating. It's really quite wonderful to have that kind of knowledge, because then the fear, which is what most of us live with, is the fear of dying. We don't have any fear of death because we really don't know what it is. It's the fear of dying, I think, that really concerns people. So the Tibetans have developed this practice, and it's quite amazing. It's really amazing, and it's a lot of visualization. It's not something that I can really, describe and tell people what they should do, because it's a very long process. But it's using a text, it's using a practice, it's using a teacher to look at the dissolution of the body, to look at the processes in the mind that start to occur as we die, and the things that we can do to actually shift our thinking in the dying process. There's a belief in Tibetan Buddhism that you can awaken in the dying process, that you can have full enlightenment when you're dying. And
is that seen as the last instrument?
Absolutely. Well, maybe. Who knows?
You know, of enlightenment. You know, right before you die,
Yes,
you
exactly.
actually use the opportunity.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
But they say you shouldn't wait until you're dying to start practicing it.
And so how do you do it before we're healthy? We don't want to think about death.
Right, but in Tibetan Buddhism, that is precisely what you're thinking about. And not everybody who practices Tibetan Buddhism does the Powa, but everybody, I think, is aware of this process. And you work with a teacher. You have to work with a teacher, you have to work with a text. There are chants that you do, there's a process, that there's union with the life force, with the divine. It's a very beautiful, intricate process, but it's so relieving of the kind of fear of unknowing, you know, that so many of us, you know, are concerned with before we die and as we die. So this gives you the opportunity to sort of look at the process of dying before it's happening, to practice ways that you can relieve your mind and that you can set your consciousness towards awakening.
What is the destination after death in the Tibetan Buddhist understanding?
Okay, well, the first destination would be full awakening without rebirth. The second would be...
What is the state of existence after full awakening?
No return to the physical body.
And your consciousness lives on with a full awareness, and you don't return to the body.
Right.
Okay.
Right. The other is rebirth, and that the later schools of Buddhism developed the 6 realms of existence. So the most rare and most wonderful, of course, is being reborn as a human. And the Tibetans say it's the rarest thing, and that we so often waste the opportunity. You know, that it's so rare to be born a human. And the way that you're born a human is by how you live in this life, whether you're going to be
accumulation
reborn.
of a kind of good karma or
That's
virtue.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
That's exactly it. And if you are unable to live a life that returns you as a human, you can be reborn as a deva in the god realms. You can be reborn as a hungry ghost. You can be reborn as an animal. You can be reborn in one of the hells by the karma that you produced by your actions during this life. How you lived is going to determine what your rebirth is going to be. But it's interesting because, you know, the historical Buddha never talked really about this whole idea of rebirth in this way, you know, and he talked about living this life, and that's what we should be focused on, is how to live this life as well as we can.
And come back to this whole idea of focusing on the consciousness of death. Is it to live better? What's the connection between that focus, awareness, and living?
I think that's a good way of putting it. I think it sort of informs how we live. It also, because it is karmically related, the actions that you take in this life will sort of determine how you die, and that's really of great import, you know, to the Tibetans in Tibetan Buddhism. So yes, I think it's very much a part of how one lives their life. And it's about the development of consciousness even within this life. So.
It's fascinating. It's about using every opportunity that you have.
Exactly.
To awake.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the Dalai Lama recently said, you know, we suffer when we think we're losing something, a relationship or something material. He said we should be thinking about how we might be wasting our lives.
Especially, you know, to be a human being is such a precious opportunity.
Absolutely.
If we don't move toward awakening, we are wasting our
Absolutely.
lives.
Absolutely.
That's amazing
Yeah.
message. So let's take another break.
Okay.
This is a Think Tech Asia. I'm your host, Hong Jiang. We'll be speaking about Tibetan Buddhism and its practice in Hawaii. We'll be right back.
Aloha, this is Keli'i Akina. It's my privilege to be the host of Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the Think Tech Hawaii broadcast network. Ehana Kako, what does that mean? Well, many people have heard of Epule Kako, let's pray together. Ehana Kako means let's work together. Let's work together to build a better economy, government, and society. And every week, Monday from 2 to 3 o'clock, you will see movers and shakers and other people who are working together to build a better economy, government, and society. Again, I'm Keli'i Akina on the Ehana Kako weekly program on the Think Tech Hawaii broadcast network. Aloha. See you here Mondays 2 to 3.
Hi, we're back. We're live. This is Think Tech Asia. I'm your host, Hong Jiang. And we'll be speaking with Dr. Patricia Masters about Tibetan Buddhism and its practice in Hawaii. So, right before the break, we talk about this whole idea of a consciousness of death. It's really to guide living.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about daily living as a Buddhist practitioner, either as a Buddhist practitioner or Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, either way? I know you associate with a lot of practitioners in Hawaii. We'll get to that later.
Right. So one of the daily practices, I think, for many of the schools of Buddhism is meditation. And there are basically two major forms of meditation within Buddhism. There are many, many sort of subsets, but the first is shamatha, which means focused concentration meditation, where you're trying to get one pointed so that you can focus your attention and focus your mind. The other is vipassana, which is insight meditation that comes out of first focusing the mind and then developing consciousness and insight from what's going on in the body, in the mind, in the feelings, in the thoughts. And then there are other forms of meditation, as everyone knows. There's Zen, which is basically a shamatha focused concentration practice. And there are forms of chanting, which I would say are a kind of meditation. The energy of the chanting. In Tibetan Buddhism, there is vipassana, they call it, which is the same insight meditation. And again, it starts with shamatha, the one-pointed concentration meditation, and then goes into vipassana. And then there are other kinds of meditative practices, both in terms of visualization. And when Tibetans talk about visualization, it's usually with an image. The image might appear on a tanka, which is like a beautiful sort of usually silk, and there's usually either a figure, Shakyamuni, or some other of the pantheon within Tibetan Buddhism, or a cosmographic representation. And you visualize either identification with that being and the qualities, really. It's not I'm identifying with Tara or Chenrezig or Shakyamuni Buddha, but I'm identifying with the qualities of those beings and sort of imbuing your own self with those, that's a meditative practice. There are others in lots of different schools. They have very distinct practices for their school. But beyond the meditation as a kind of practice and the other sort of things that they do in Tibetan Buddhism using mantra, which are sacred words that have energetic and also sacred secret meanings sometimes, or mandala practice, the practice of looking at, again, a cosmographic representation and entering into that cosmographic representation, or mudra practice. Mudra are sort of hand movements that have meaning, and it helps in the sort of spiritual development. So there are so many different practices within the different schools. But the other side of it is the ethical practices.
Okay.
And that's really important. I think that's an ongoing, everyday kind of practice.
That's where I think our audience members will be really interested
Right.
in it, because a lot of people are not professional kind of practitioners. They're
Right.
not nuns or monks.
Right.
They live in daily lives.
Right.
So how can a Buddhist practice guide their daily lives? And tell us more.
Yeah. Well, there are several sort of ideas about how to practice an ethical life. There are developing wholesome thoughts, developing wholesome words, developing wholesome actions. That's one of the practices. Some of the qualities are generosity, compassion, loving kindness, equanimity of mind, joy for others. So those are sort of qualities that the Buddha suggested that we should develop. Tolerance for ourselves and tolerance for others. Tolerance for those who we don't even agree with.
Yeah, yeah.
And it doesn't mean, passively sort of not sort of having a discerning kind of mind about some of the ideas that people might present to us, but being tolerant of the possibilities of other people's ideas. So again, because there's no Godhead in Buddhism, meaning there's no God figure, you can be a Christian and practice Buddhist sort of practices. You can be a Jew, a Muslim, whatever, because there's no problem, at least from the Buddhist perspective. It's a way of living. That's the way I would describe Buddhism, is really an ethical way of living your life.
And the qualities you have just described are the qualities we really need in the world. Every place in the world would need that.
Exactly.
And I suppose, any workplace, they would like to have colleagues who are practitioners.
Absolutely.
And if you have these people in your midst,
Yeah.
then you probably have a better relationship.
It's so true, and you can feel it quite often, it seems to me, when somebody's practicing those things, and not practicing them like, oh, I must be a compassionate person, but actually sort of inculcating those qualities within yourself.
Yeah,
And it's really a kind of a concerted effort, but it's something that becomes very much a part of who you are.
That's right. Yeah.
The Dalai Lama, when he's asked about what his religion is, he always answers, my religion is kindness. And I love that. And kindness is sort of loving kindness, which is metta in Pali, one of the languages of Buddhism, or maitri in Sanskrit. And loving kindness is one of those foundations, But I love that he says that. People can relate to it so easily.
I know he has simple words, but they are so profound.
Exactly.
Try to follow it. That's where
Exactly.
you find it's really challenging.
Exactly.
Yeah. We have a few more minutes for the program. When did Buddhism? When did Buddhism come to the U.S.? I know it would have been coming over a different time, but what's the peak?
Well, it's interesting. There's a very good book by a man who's no longer with us, a man named Rick Fields, called "When the Swans Came to the Lake," and he does a whole historical sort of survey of Buddhism coming to America, and some of the earliest writings that were brought early 18th century, early 19th century. The Transcendentalists became very interested in Buddhism. The World Parliaments of Religion that occurred in 1893 brought Buddhists from Japan, from China, from Sri Lanka, and really introduced Buddhism in a big way, because it was among hundreds and hundreds of religious sort of people. And then they stayed after the Parliament and met with all kinds of people who may not have been practitioners of any other faith, and introduced some of the practices and ideas of Buddhism. So it was at least by the late 19th century, people in America really came to know about Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Southern Buddhism through this particular Buddhist master named Anagarika Dharmapala. So it even came to Hawaii at that same time, and Dharmapala came and visited in 1893.
I guess Hawaii is unique because of the Asia connection there.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have more schools of Buddhism in Hawaii than anywhere else.
So let's talk about Tibetan Buddhism in Hawaii and Buddhism in Hawaii in general.
Great. Yeah, Tibetan Buddhism came here really and got established in 1974. And the person who was most responsible for establishing it, there had been Tibetan teachers coming through, but the establishment of a center was in 1974 by Kalu Rinpoche, K-A-L-U. He's no longer living. There, he has a reincarnate, and that's another interesting feature of Tibetan Buddhism, is that they believe that great teachers are reincarnated, and so that so this Dalai Lama is the 14th Dalai Lama. The Karmapa, who's they're sort of equals in their spiritual development, if you will. Some people would argue, but he's the 17th Karmapa. Kalu Rinpoche, I don't remember what number the one who's living now is, but so they're reincarnates of very advanced spiritual teachers. So, and that's another whole interesting dimension of Tibetan Buddhism. So there are places to practice Tibetan Buddhism. The one on Oahu is on Gartley Place in Nu'uanu. It's called the Kagyu Tarchen Ling, Tegchen Ling, and that was the one that was established by Kalu Rinpoche. There are Tibetan lamas here and teachers. There are about 3 or 4 Tibetan groups on the Big Island. The Wood Valley Temple, one of the Dharma centers. There's one in Kauai. There are 2 in Maui that I know of. There may be even more. So there are places to practice Tibetan Buddhism in Hawaii. There are places to practice all kinds of Buddhism. Yeah, and of course Buddhism came here originally with the Japanese immigrants who were brought here to work the plantations, and they were in spiritual need, and so there were priests who were brought here as early as the 1850s, and they established temples. The first temple was the Honganji, not the one that's on the Pali Highway now, but its precursor was, or predecessor was on Fort Street, right near us here. And then the Chinese Buddhists came, the Korean Buddhists, and then, of course, what they call in scholarly circles, if you will, immigrant Buddhism, which is the Buddhism that comes from another place to serve that particular immigrant community. And then there are other sorts of Buddhism that have arisen within an environment. We even have what I think is coming to be an American Buddhism. And I don't think it's sectarian, but I think it's the largest populations are the Zen Buddhists, the American Zen Buddhists, and the Vipassana Buddhists, who are Southern, or Nikaya Buddhists, Theravadan Buddhists, if you will. So there are temples. There's a website. It's called HonoluluDharma.com, and you can go on there and you can find all the temples and organizations of Buddhism. It's just been launched. It's still needing to be tweaked a little bit, but it's there, and you can find out.
To have that resource.
Yeah, you can find out who's doing what practices and all that.
Talk about the weekly Wednesday Dharma talk that you are giving.
Okay, so there's a wonderful place called the Bodhi Tree Meditation Center. It's in Nu'uanu. It's on Judd Street. And we have meditation Monday. There's a man named Joe Bright who does Vipassana. I do Wednesday evenings Vipassana meditation.
And when do you start?
At 6:30 in
6:30.
the evening.
And people just can
And
just
it's
come.
free, they can come,
Yeah.
anybody is welcome. And then I give a Dharma talk after the
I've been there. It's so beautiful and
Yeah.
so peaceful and
Yeah.
just a wonderful experience. I
Thank you.
recommend it to everybody.
Yeah,
And thank you so much, Pat, for being with us today.
Thank you, hon.
And that was Patricia Masters on Tibetan Buddhism and its practice in Hawaii. And I am your host, Hong Jiang. This is a Think Tech Asia. Thank you so much for tuning in.